Hank Paulson takes the plunge. The hit on investment banking at Merrill Lynch for much of the Stan O'Neill era was a charming, gregarious, politically shrewd executive named Greg Fleming. He was only 39 years old when he took charge of Merrill's investment banking arm, a job he got in the summer of 2003 after O'Neill fired Tom Patrick and then pushed out Arshad Zakaria, who had overseen investment banking. Fleming had a knack for getting powerful men to warm up to him. It was one of the reasons he was a good investment banker. After the 9 to 11 attacks damaged Merrill's headquarters, he and about 100 of his employees camped out on an empty floor provided by BlackRock, according to the Wall Street Journal. BlackRock was the big money management firm Larry Fink and founded in 1989 after leaving First Boston. A friendship soon developed between the two men, which 4.5 years later helped bring about a $9.8 billion deal in which Merrill took a 49.8% stake in BlackRock, while Fink's firm took control of Merrill's money management unit. Fleming had befriended O'Neill in similar fashion. They had known each other since the mid-1990s, when Fleming was a wet behind the ears investment bankers and O'Neill was a man on the make. After O'Neill was named president, with the top job all but warranted, Fleming made a point of getting together with him. We'd talk about what was going on, who was doing what. He actually became an advisor, O'Neill told the Journal. We helped educate me very quickly. Fleming had been a believer in O'Neill early on, agreeing with his assessment that Merrill culture needed toughening up. Over time, however, in relationship with O'Neill got testier, especially as O'Neill became more insulated. After the BlackRock deal, the Journal wrote an article highlighting Fleming's role. Although O'Neill was caught in it, Fleming got the strong sense that O'Neill resented the fact that he had gotten the publicity. Also, unlike most of the executive, O'Neill surrounded himself with after I affair Patrick. Fleming was willing to speak with his mind. Although Fleming had perfect pitch when it came to knowing just how far he could push O'Neill, unlike his peers in the executive suite, he did push. For instance, O'Neill desperately wanted to buy a mortgage originator, which many of Merrill's competitors used to supply them with the raw material for mortgage-backed securities and CDOs. Fleming unsuccessfully prevented Merrill from buying New Century, a company that would turn out to be one of the worst of the supreme lenders, and which Merrill had come within a hair of buying. According to one former executive, Fleming was the executive O'Neill said he could no longer have dinner with because it was too painful to hear Fleming disagree with him. And one other thing, Fleming had a close relationship with Jeff Contral. As one of O'Neill's top deputies, Fleming had gotten early word of the firing. He couldn't believe it. Contral wasn't just a good trader, he was probably the best trader Merrill had. He had been around mortgage banked securities his whole career, going back to Salomon Brothers and Leo Ranieri. He was deeply loyal to Merrill, where he had worked for 17 years. Though he didn't have the title, he was clearly the head of trading at Merrill Lynch. Fleming's first instinct was to try to get the decision reversed. He asked O'Neill to move Grontal and his team to Fleming's jurisdiction and let them continue to run the credit desk. After thinking it over, O'Neill said no. Fleming recalls an early morning phone call from O'Neill in which he told Fleming he needed to pay Ball. When Fleming asked O'Neill why Grontal had to be fired, O'Neill replied, "You don't understand. Dysfunction is good on Wall Street." Though Kidd told Fleming that under no circumstance was he to give Control Hall advance word that he was being let go. That was Kim's job, and he would be doing it soon enough. It was the middle of July 2006. Fleming and his wife were in London. When they were out shopping one day, Fleming's cell phone began ringing and ringing. It was Grontal. At first, Fleming ignored the calls, but as they kept coming, his wife asked him what was going on. When he told her, she urged him to stop taking the calls and talk to his friend. Grontal told Fleming he was hearing rumors that he had many of Merrill's veteran traders were all going to be fired. Fleming hummed and hewed, but by the end of their long, argued, teary conversation, Grontal knew that the rumors were true. Fleming didn't speak to O'Neill for a month and a half. The ice was broken only when O'Neill pleaded with Fleming not to leave the firm, something he had been contemplating. Fleming did stay. In fact, he stayed right through the financial crisis, becoming Merrill president along the way and brokering the deal Merrill could with Bank of America on the infamous Lehman weekend in September 2008. But the Grontal firing was something he never stopped thinking about, not only because it betrayed a lack of basic human dignity, as Fleming would later put it, and not only because it was so unnecessary. To Fleming, that July day in 2006, when Grontal and his team were fired, was the day Merrill Lynch's fate was sealed. Yes, Fleming knew he was biased, given what later happened, it seemed irrefutable. Prior to that day, Merrill may well have avoided the supreme problems that would soon bring Wall Street to its knees. After that date, Merrill was doomed to make the same mistakes and as most of its competitors. The reason Jeff Control had to be fired was that several months earlier, O'Neill had been persuaded to bring in a fast rising bond salesman named Osman Samersi and give him a title, Global Head of Fixed Income Currencies and Commodities, that effectively made him Cromwell boss. Somersby, a 39-year-old British citizen of Turkish descent, had a reputation for being extremely driven and extremely aggressive, exactly the traits O'Neill wanted on the trading desk. Somersby wouldn't be afraid to take big risks to generate big profits. He wouldn't be excessively cautious the way Cromwell sometimes was. Somersby also had a reputation for being a mean boss, which O'Neill didn't mean at all. He was in your face, says a former Merrill executive. He had a reputation internally that if you got on his bad side, he would write your name down and look for a chance to get you. Merrill traders used to call it the blacklist. Somersby would actually walk the floors with a pen and Ziploc in hand, writing down things he didn't like. Somersby was also someone who couldn't tolerate anyone who might be a threat to him. Cromwell, the most respected trader at Merrill Lynch, certainly fit the bill. So, as a condition of taking the promotion, he insisted that he be able to fire Cromwell and those close to him and assemble his own team of executives and traders. O'Neill assented. He also insisted that he never gave the report to Greg Fleming, whom he lauded. O'Neill assented to that as well, though Kim had been one of the men who convinced O'Neill to promote Somersby. The other was Merrill Chief Administrative Officer Amos Fakahani. Although Fakahani had spent his career on the administrative side of Merrill, overseeing such functions as human resource and computer systems, he wielded outsized power because he was indisputably the one executive who was close to O'Neill. Fakahani was the one guy who could go into Stan's office, close the door, and say, "Can you believe?" Say, "Can you believe?" says a former executive. He had worked in the Merrill Finance office when O'Neill had been CFO and had essentially hitched his wagon to O'Neill pony. By general consensus, Fakahani was deeply in over his head. He knew virtually nothing about trading or about the complications of managing a balance sheet the size of Merrill's. He was also in charge of Merrill Wright's management function, another subject about which he knew next to nothing. He was banking Semercy more because he knew Semercy would appeal to O'Neill than because Semercy knew how to run a mortgage desk. In fact, Semercy knew very little about the credit markets. He didn't understand US based risk, says a former Merrill executive. O'Neill would later tell friends that nobody had recommended Gronhall for a promotion, while Semercy had been recommended by two of his top guys, Fakahani and Kim. But that remark just serves to illustrate how out of touch O'Neill had become. O'Neill had never been the kind of CEO who walked the trading floor. The intricacies of the firm's trading position held no interest for him, except to the extent they showed profits of losses. His constant demand that his trading executives take more risks was based mainly on his anyone's that Goldman Sachs and Lehman Brothers had more profitable trading desks rather than one deep understanding of what those risks entailed. His feel for the firm's risk position came primarily from reading the daily board reports. Whenever he went to Washington or attended conference, he would hear about the riskiness of, say, leveraged loans. So he kept close tabs on that part of the business, but nobody ever mentioned possible problems with mortgage bonds, so he didn't worry about them. By 2006, O'Neill was so divorced from his own firm that he failed to appreciate the utter lunacy of Semercy's desire to clean house. Did he really think Semercy could get rid of the firm's most experienced mortgage traders and not arm the mortgage desk? Sadly, it seems that O'Neill didn't think about it all. The arrival of Semercy should have put Dow Kim and Heath on high alert, if only because he had no way of knowing whether Semercy was up to the job. Semercy was coming into his new position with a lot of pressure on him. Thought Riccardi was gone. Thought Chris Riccardi was gone, Merrill desperately wanted to maintain its position as the number one CDO underwriter, and says a former Merrill colleague, Semercy felt another kind of Wall Street pressure. Osman wanted to make a lot of money in a short period of time. The CDO business was changing. AIG had stopped insuring super senior tranches. The banks that had always bought the super senior weren't buying them anymore. CDOs were becoming harder to sell to inventors. Yet, from the summer of 2006, when Grönhall and the other veteran traders were outset, to the summer of 2007, Merrill Lynch continued to churn out CDOs. It retained its position as the number one underwriter. The mortgage desk repaid fees and posted profits. The traders themselves made buy bonuses. Whenever anyone asked, Semercy would tell Merrill executives that the firm had very little exposure to subprime mortgage risk. He had made all this money for the firm, he said, while de-risking the portfolio. But he told no one how exactly he was accomplishing this. Incredible, no one thought to ask. Instead, from the barn to the trading floor, everyone simply assumed that all was well, that the business was being run the same way it had always been run, but it wasn't. There was one person at Merrill Lynch who might well have asked the right questions, had he been in a position to do so. His name was John Braid, and he was a risk manager who specialized in evaluating derivatives risk. A calm, soft-spoken ex-CCC, Braid had joined the long march from academia to Wall Street, landing at Merrill Lynch in 1990. He was hardly anti-derivatives. Like most quants, he believed that derivatives were a useful tool. Nor was he the king of risk manager who feared a risk. On the contrary, he was one of the people who believed that Merrill had shot itself in the foot by being too risk averse in year one gone by. The problem with O'Neill's Merrill, Braid believed, was that even as the CEO was pushing the desk to take more risk, the institution still recoiled at a 50 million loss. Merrill's schizophrenia about risk caused traders to seek out risks that wouldn't show up in the risk models, Braid believed. If the bar is small, he liked to say, it means we are taking risks in things we can measure. Braid used to tell Merrill management that Bar didn't measure black swans, the rare but real risk that could destroy a firm. That was its fatal flaw. Braid had also learned over the years that by the standards of a physicist, Wall Street was quantitatively illiterate. Executives learned terms like standard deviation and normal contribution, but they didn't really understand the math, so they got lulled into thinking it was magic. Traders came to believe the formulas were not an approximation of reality but reality itself. which is also why firms needed good risk management departments, he believed. The managers were the ones who imposed the reality checks that the traders preferred to ignore. But ever since Fakahani had been put in charge of it, Merrill Lynch Risk's department had been in step decline. Historically, the top risk executive at Merrill reported directly to the chief financial officer. That was fine when Merrill had a strong CFO like Tom Patrick, who knew that part of the job was to adjudicate the inevitable disputes between the risk manager and the trading desk over what continued too much risk. As head of Merrill's market risk, Braid had reported to Patrick. Once Fakahavi took over risk management, the risk officer's influence began to wane. Within a year, Braid lost his access to the board. Fakahani seemed to view the disputes between trader and risk managers as squabbling among children. As a former risk manager put it, slowly risk management went from being primarily a front office function, meaning that risk managers sat on trading desk, to a back office function where they looked at models and spreadsheets and had very little interaction with the traders. And they started to make less money. A former risk manager explains. A number of good risk managers either left Merrill Lynch or became traders. In early 2005, Fakahani decided to push the risk management function down a notch further. He promoted the executive who was head of credit risk to be a king of risk, Caesar, to whom all the other risk managers will now have to report instead of the Fakahani directly. Furious at what he saw as the degradation of the risk function, Braid sent Merrill's CFO, Jeff Edwards, a letter of resignation, and he left the firm. He was away for only a few months, however, late that spring one of the fixed income desk suffered a big loss. Kim tracked down Braid and asked him to return to Merrill, where he would have a desk on the trading floor and work for him personally. Although Braid rejoined the firm's oversight committee, he had no real authority within the firm, because Grunthal and the other veteran trader knew him and trusted him. Braid was able to develop what he called his SP network to keep a preset of the risks the desk were taking. Once Semercy took over, everything changed. The SP network dried up, though Kim, who wanted to leave and start IH, found O'Neill had asked him to stay after the Grunthal firing was losing interest, which also meant that, like virtually everyone else at Merrill Lynch, Braid had no idea what Semercy was doing with Merrill's CDO business. thought he was one of the few people left at Merrill with the knowledge and background to sniff out problem trades. He was shut out entirely. Toward the end of 2006, Merrill Lynch took a final step in its ongoing quest to be the dominant Wall Street player in subprime mortgage. It finally bought that mortgage originator O'Neill had been hankering for. The company was First Franklin, a unit of National City Corporation that had made 28 billion in mortgage loans the year before, virtually all of them subprime. The purchase price was 1.3 billion. Now Merrill will have its own source of mortgage that it could securitize to its heart's content, or so the company hoped. The Merrill executive who had been handed the job of landing a mortgage company for Merrill was Michael Blum. In truth, Blum was not a big fan of the first Franklin purchase, though he had dutifully completed it. In 2005, he and his staff held a meeting with O'Neill to lay out Merrill's possible option for getting into the mortgage originating business. O'Neill was eager to get going. Lehman Brothers already made four times what Merrill made in mortgage, in part because it owned B&C Mortgage, the eighth largest subprime company in the country. Bloom thought the firm should start up its own originator rather than buy one. Buying something will be painful because they are not well managed companies and they are at the bottom of the food chain, he told O'Neill, according to people who were in the meeting. O'Neill asked him how long it would take to build a subprime company from the ground up. 3 or 4 years, replied Bloom. O'Neill gave Bloom a steely look. I'm 54 years old, he replied, and I don't have 3 or 4 years. Bloom was also astounded by the price Merrill was willing to pay. But Merrill was so eager to get in the game that it would likely have paid even more. Bloom could take comfort only in the fact that it wasn't New Century. First Franklin was supposed to be one of the better-run subprime companies. Almost immediately after the deal was completed, First Franklin began taking losses. Like all the subprime originators, it had kept the residuals and posted gains that reflected an optimistic estimate of their value. Now, as delinquents rose, those gains were being reserved. In a meeting in January 2007, as Bloom was going through the losses in the residual book, Dow came suddenly looking up from his BlackBerry with some news. Lehman Brothers just had a record quarter in mortgage, he said, according to someone at the meeting. I guess they're just smarter than we are, Bloom replied. And so it went. In a February meeting, Bloom and his team argued that delinquencies were likely to get worse. He wanted Merrill to start hedging its exposure. Dale Latancio, whom Semercy had installed to run the CDO business after Riccardi, brought out a series of charts using the 1998 long-term capital management failure as his worst case scenario. If something like that were to happen, he said, Merrill could lose as much as 70 million. Anything short of that scenario, the firm will be fine. After the meeting, a rights manager told Kim that there's no way Latanzio's estimate was right. Kim asked the rights manager to poke around and come up with a better estimate, according to a former Merrill executive. But the rights manager couldn't get any information out of Latanzio and Semercy and had to drop the effort. Bloom couldn't understand how two people running the CDO business could be so sanguine. They were using the same raw material he was, subprime mortgage. By early 2007, the defaults were the highest they had been in 6 years. When subprime 1 had collapsed, HSBC, the big British bank, said in February that its bad debt charges would be 30% higher than previously anticipated, thanks to its deteriorating subprime business. And yet, Merrill's mortgage desk continued to churn out CDOs and post profits. In the first quarter of 2007, the firm underwrote 26 CDOs, of which 19 were made up primarily of subprime mortgage. First Franklin was taking 50 billion to 100 billion in quarterly write-downs, and top management at Merrill was all over Bloom about its deteriorating financials. Yet, somehow the CDO business remained untouched. How could this be? In April, Bloom gave a presentation to the board in which he put for a downbeat and sober-minded assessment of the subprime business. Afterward, many of the board members sent him thank you emails for his plain-spoken presentation. What they had failed to notice, however, was that seated next to Bloom at the board meeting was Osman Semercy. He never said a word about any problems he might be having with subprime mortgage, nor did anyone think to ask him. To the outside world, the news that Paulson was leaving Goldman Sachs to become Treasury Secretary could not have been less surprising. Didn't every senior Goldman Sachs executive eventually join the government? By that point, the list included John Whitehead, Deputy Secretary of State in the Reagan administration, Steve Friedman, National Economic Council, Joshua Bolten, OMB Director, and George W. Bush, Chief of Staff, John Cornyn, Senator and later Governor of New Jersey, Robert Rubin, of course, and many others. Yet, to Goldman insiders, Paulson's department was startling. He had never expressed the slightest interest in the job. He didn't make lavish campaign contributions or serve as finance chairman for ambitious politicians or even hang around politicians. He told everyone, whether they were close confidants or passing acquaintances, that he was staying put at Goldman. Heat fakes had never been his style, as he later related in his memoir. When he first got the call from the White House in the spring of 2006, he agreed to a meeting with the president, but then quickly canceled when John Rogers, the firm's veteran Washington Hunt, told him that going to the meeting was tantamount to accepting the offer. Having been through several ineffectual Treasury secretaries, Bush wanted Paulson badly, largely because his Goldman Sachs credential gave him a stature his predecessor had lacked. Paulson was initially derided by fear of failure, fear of the unknown, he later wrote, but he finally said, yes, I didn't want to look back and have been asked to serve my country and declined it. He later explained it, so I just took the plunges. He did so after getting an unprecedented agreement from Bush that he wouldn't have real power, regular access to the president on a part with the secretaries of State and Defense, and the ability to bring in his own people. For Paulson, one of the toughest part of his decision was telling his mother, his entire family, including his wife, Wendy, and his mom, Mariana, was the blind opposite to the Bush administration. In his book, Paulson recalls standing in the kitchen of his house in Barrington, Illinois, announcing the news. You started with Nixon and you are going to end with Bush? His mother replied, why would you do such a thing? In some ways, Paulson was an odd choice for Bush. As an ardent environmentalist, Paulson believed that climate change was real, a view not embraced by the White House. More important, he was neither a partisan Republican nor a free market ideology. He would later cite the pressure on him to get rid of Sarbanes-Oxley, the law passed in the wake of the Enron scandal, which Republicans in Congress hated. Paulson refused. I don't find a single provision bad, he said. He also worried about the widening gap between rich and poor, also not a subject often discussed in the Bush White House. In a speech at Columbia on August 1, 2006, he said that amid this country's strong economic expansion, many Americans simply aren't feeling the benefits. The comments sent Republicans into a dizzy. Like all captains of industry who joined the Treasury, Paulson was in for a bit of a shock after his nomination was approved by the Senate in July 2006. He had he hadn't understood how outdated treasury system where there was no real-time access to market information, and the voicemail system was antiquated. As he recounts in his book, he was shocked to discover that an extraordinary civil servant named Fred Adams had been calculating the interest rates on trillions of dollars in treasury debt by hand nearly every day for 30 years, including holidays. Nor had Poulson fully appreciated how limited Treasury's tools were. Treasury was not a bank regulator. It had moral suasion, but no supervisory levers, and it couldn't spend money unless it had been appropriate. At Goldman, he had the responsibility, but also unbridled command over thousands, says one Treasury employee. Here, he had the responsibility times 1,000, but no ability to command. The new Treasury Secretary gave long-time department ideas a bit of a shock as well. People were taken aback by Hank's aggressiveness, says once staffer. He is force of nature. He gets people to do stuff they'd never do. They weren't used to a boss as relentless or as blunt as he was. Poulson also made decisions by talking and frequently repeating himself. If you're in a meeting with experts, usually let the experts talk, says one staffer. But when it's Hank, then the first 10 minutes are Hank talking. Like many, the staffer grew to respect and admire Poulson. Besides, why would Poulson suspect that Wall Street securitization process was deeply flawed? After all, Goldman Sachs had moved into this business on Poulson watch. Poulson was part of the machine, not outside it. That also meant for all of Poulson's worries about derivatives, he didn't understand the dangerous potential of credit default swaps on mortgage. Paulson certainly wasn't alone. Everyone else on Wall Street and in Washington shared his views. In late 2005, Bernanke said that home prices, rather than being in bubble territory, reflect strong economic fundamentals. In 2006, he said that he expected the housing market to cool but not to change very sharply. He went on to tell CNBC, We've never had a decline in house prices on a nationwide basis. So, what I think more likely is that house prices will slow, maybe stabilize. As late as the spring of 2007, he said, We believe the effect of the trouble in the subprime sector on the broader housing market will likely be limited, and we do not expect significant spillovers from the subprime market to the rest of the economy or the financial system. Another reason for Poulson's blind spot, say people who worked with him, was that he had too much faith in regulators. He thought the regulators were more capable than they were, says a safer. Paulson today considers he'd put too much faith in regulation itself. During his time in office, Paulson would change his tune. The system was so outdated and screwed up, you just couldn't have imagined it. He'd later say a big part of the problem, of course, was that both the regulators and Paulson assumed that financial institutions were more competent than they were. Paulson spent his career at Goldman, which at least didn't need anyone else to tell it how to protect its own bottom line. He had no idea that other firms weren't as capable of looking out for their own interest. No financial institution wants to blow itself up, he'd later explain. So I've always taken some confidence in the fact that their survival instinct would help protect the system. But I was shocked by how bad risk management was in some institutions, and many banks thought they were smarter than they were. By 2006, John Dugan, the comptroller of the currency, was speaking to other regulators about the growth in non-traditional subprime mortgage, according to several former Treasury officials. But there was a disconnect, says one official. The people in the Treasury building who spent most of their time on housing were the economics. The people on the small senior staff, people were not talking every day. Looking back, you can see how one thing will lead to another, how mortgages were used to create instruments that were used to create leverage, but no one made the connection at the time. There was another component to the thinking too. The leverage in the system had built up slowly. It was a gradual process that got us to where we were, says a former Treasury official. So you'd think it would be a gradual process that got us out. In this assumption, however, they could not have been more wrong.